back to my channel, or welcome if it's your first time here. I'm Lindsay, and this is like the first unscripted video I'm doing in over a month. Because I just didn't script it, and I figured I don't need a script for this. And sure, it'll be fine and well organized and not be all over the place, and I will talk and make sense. So I did a short a while ago where I showed some fantasy books to help you get into fantasy. I think it was a trend. But I figured I would do a longer video where I could show more books and explain a little bit more why I recommend these books. So this isn't in a specific order. I didn't organize this in a, you should read this book first, or this level of reading, you know, like YA, middle grade, whatever. Most of these are YA. I do have, I don't know if this is an adult book, and I do have a couple middle grade, and I think this might be younger kids, but I just kind of organized it in a way that it wouldn't fall. So I just have the biggest at the bottom and the smallest at the top, but I do start with this one that is, I don't know if it's middle grade or if it's for younger children. I do think younger children can read it. It is a chapter book, so I guess that's middle grade. I don't really know how the rankings work, but this is called Dealing with Dragons. It's by Patricia C. Reed. I don't know if I pronounced that right, so I'm very sorry. It's a very cute fantasy book that just has the meat and bones of fantasy. It's a princess and there's dragons, and see, they're chilling with the dragons. That's why I loved it, because dragons. But yeah, it's just this kind of medieval-esque fantasy world. It's a whole series. I believe there's 4 books in the series. I've only read 2. And even as an adult, I'm gonna, because I didn't know there were more, but as an adult I'm gonna read the rest of it because it's such a cute series and it just really understands fantasy. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but if you get it, it does. So in the second one, there is a like enchanted forest. It's very much your basic fantasy book, and I think it's a really good way to step into fantasy, especially if you are younger. So, and even as an adult, you can read middle grade books, it's okay. So the next one, I'm sure everyone has at least heard of because it's a really popular movie, The Princess Bride. I do believe, this isn't the movie cover. It looks like it's the movie cover, but those are not the actors from the movie. So it's by William Goldman, who also worked very closely on the movie, and it differs from the movie a bit in the sense that you get a lot more of the characters' backgrounds. You get a lot more of Fezzik's background and Inigo Montoya's background, and they have very interesting stories, and it's humorous. Okay, so this is supposed to be spoiler free, but I'm gonna give this little spoiler, so I'll tell you where to skip ahead to if you don't want to hear it, but it's not that big of a spoiler. Basically, there's this ongoing joke throughout the book where he mentions a unabridged version, and he'll start talking about something and then he'll say, but you'll hear more about that in the unabridged version if you read the unabridged version. So I, at one point, put the book down and was like, I need to get this unabridged version. I fully fell for it. It's a joke. There is no unabridged version. He got me. He really bamboozled me, but it's so good. It has, I highly recommend this book. As for fantasy, I will say it's not the most in-depth fantasy world, fantasy story. There are just little fantasy aspects. However, if you've seen the movie, you understand what I'm talking about with that. There is still fantasy, and it is very much like a medieval type world. And yeah, it's highly recommend this book if you want to get into fantasy. I didn't put it in my short because of the fact that it's not heavily a fantasy story, but it's still good. It's still good, especially if you're trying to ease yourself into fantasy and don't want a ton of magic right off. Highly recommend this book. Now, next one has a lot more fantasy. Again, is a movie. Neil Gaiman, Stardust. Stardust by Neil Gaiman. I don't know why I said it in that order. So Neil Gaiman's a very popular author. He wrote Coraline and Good Omens and a lot. I'm sure there's a lot more I'm not thinking of. I've read American Gods, Smoke and Mirrors, so much by Neil Gaiman. This is still my favorite book by him, even though I really love Good Omens, because it is such a classic fantasy story. I actually saw the movie first, and the book does differ from the movie. He, I believe, worked on both. Both are funny. I found Neil Gaiman books to always have a little bit of sense of humor. I don't know about Coraline. Haven't read Coraline because the movie freaked me out. But it's a story about how do I put this? It's one of those fantasy stories where there's a real world and there's a fantasy world, and people cross over into that fantasy world and go on adventures. It's a nice adventure story. So it's about Tristram Thorn, and he meets a fallen star. So it's a star woman. So here's the thing that is always so interesting to me. Ben Barnes is in the movie as Dunstan Thorn, that's Tristan Thorn's dad. In the very beginning, he's the one who kind of discovers this fantasy world. And so he's in this movie where a blonde woman is a star, and also he's in Voyage of the Dawn Treader where he's Caspian, who marries Liliandel, who is a blonde woman who's a star. So I just want to know, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right? Like, and also, sidebar, he plays 2 characters, one's in a show and one's he's in the Picture of Dorian Gray, where a painting is tormenting him. I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right? I need to have a talk with Ben Barnes because I want to know. I want to know what's going on there. But yeah, I went on a sidebar. Highly recommend this book, one of my favorites. Fantasy romance. There's romance in here, so I couldn't forget to mention that. This is a good fantasy romance start that isn't one of the really popular fantasy romances. Again, just highly recommend it. I don't know what else to tell you other than you should read this book because it's really good and it's very cute, heartwarming story, but it also has a lot of fantasy and adventure, and just there's unicorns, are there pirates in the book? Oh my gosh, I can't remember because it's been a while since I've read the book, and I've seen the movie a few times because after I watched it, I like showed it to multiple people, and there's pirates in the movie, and I can't remember if they're not in the book or their story's just different in the book, but I just understand there's all this, there's the fallen star, there's these like there's this really funny family rivalry that it's you just gotta read it. I'm trying to spoil it, so you just gotta read it. Next is, I feel like everyone's heard of this. It's currently a show, just came out, The Lightning Thief. This is another middle grade fantasy book about Greek gods and demigods. Percy Jackson, he's a demigod, and he just finds out and goes to Camp Half-Blood, and he is one of the children of the big 3 of Poseidon, and so yeah, his life is kind of thrown for a loop, and chaos ensues and adventure ensues, and it's a great story of friendship. There is, of course, some romance, but there is, I mean, he's like 12 in the beginning, and then I think he grows up to be 16 by the Sea of Monsters, if I'm oh, nope, The Last Olympian is the one that's the last one. Was the last one when I read them. It hadn't come out yet. I think it came out while I was reading them. And then years later we have The Chalice of the Gods, and then there's another one I guess coming out next year. And yeah, really gets a lot of people into Greek mythology. I know it did for me. I know it did for a lot of my friends back in middle school. And there is a bite taken out of this book. It's clearly very old, if you can tell. I'm pretty sure, because I read this in middle school and I got a puppy in middle school, so that's probably what happened here. Yeah, cannot recommend this more if you haven't read it. Again, if you're an adult, you can still enjoy it because yes, you'll realize like, oh yes, this is for much younger readers. However, the sense of humor is still there, and I still get a kick out of a lot of the jokes, so highly recommend it. So here we are, we're getting deeper into fantasy here. Aragon. If you haven't read Aragon by Christopher Paolini, I cannot recommend it more. For the dragons, for that, you can tell that it takes different aspects from other fantasy worlds as well. You can also tell that Christopher Paolini, when he started writing it, I think he was like 19, so you can tell as the books progress, you can see him maturing. However, it's not horribly written, it's not very juvenile, it's still a very enjoyable story. There is a romance subplot for anyone looking for romance. I think this is like the OG Dragon Riders story, just from my experience. This is definitely the first one, besides dealing with dragons, which they aren't really dragon riders, they're more like friends of the dragons and they work with the dragons. This, like, I'm a dragon rider, so very much dragon lore, fantasy adventure. There's dwarves, there's elves. It has a lot of, you can see some Tolkien influence, you can also see some Star Wars influence in there, but I do very much recommend this if you haven't read it yet. If you're just getting into fantasy, this is a very again, like meat and bones of fantasy, where you have magic and adventure and a protagonist that is the chosen one type deal. I would say The Lightning Thief also has that, but yeah. Oh, did I even mention that The Princess Bride is also romance? I feel like I didn't need to say that because if you haven't seen the movie, you've at least heard the movie and at least have an idea of what the movie's about. So I feel like that's why I didn't say a ton about this one. But yeah, this next book was in my short as well. It's The Six of Crows. So The Six of Crows is a spin-off duology from the Shadow and Bone series. So I would also recommend reading the Shadow and Bone series if you're interested. Personally, I recommend Six of Crows more just because I liked this series better, and I don't think you necessarily need to read Shadow and Bone to understand what's going on here. They do tell you a bit about the world, but if you really, really, really want to understand the world more, Shadow and Bone is going to get you more set up in the world than Six of Crows does. However, again, I don't think you need to read Shadow and Bone. It's a found family, group of little misfits, kind of criminals that made their own little family, and they go on their adventures. They do a heist. There is some enemies to lovers in here. There is some other mutual pining in here. It has LGBT plus characters, and I loved these books. I cried at the end of the second one, so do prepare yourself for that. It's a very interesting fantasy world that incorporates modern technology. A lot of these that I've mentioned before have like a medieval type world, but this has guns, and it has people that their magic can manipulate modern technology and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's very interesting, different kind of fantasy world. Highly recommend. It's YA, and if there's a show on Netflix. No, there's not a show. There is a show. Okay, hold on. Let me hold up. Reverse it. Okay, so there's the Shadow and Bone show on Netflix that the Six of Crows characters are in as well. So it kind of goes into their story on the show, but I highly recommend reading the books because they were going to do more. It sounded like at the end of season 2 they were going to do more that things that happen in the books, but unfortunately that got canceled. Are we surprised? Because Netflix is the way that it is. But yeah, I just cannot recommend this enough for YA fantasy. And again, Shadow and Bone if you want to read Shadow and Bone. Mine, unfortunately, I read it after the Netflix show was announced, and so it has one of those permanent stickers. That's not a sticker, it's just in the cover, and I just have a bone to pick with these. Don't do that. Don't do that. Thank you. This is not a permanent sticker, I just can't get it off. The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I have a whole video explaining why this is my favorite book series. I love Elfheim. I love the Folk of the Air, the whole world that Holly Black has created. I have some obsession with her world building. It is a very, again, meat and bones of fantasy in the Fae world. You would learn a lot about Fae lore if it's something that you don't know about already. So I highly recommend that for getting into fantasy if you don't really know a lot about Fae. She does a good job of setting that up. You'll be introduced to a lot of different fantasy creatures, Fae creatures specifically, and Selkie and all. Like, it's just such an interesting world. I'm sure I've already said this, but it really makes you feel like you're in a different world, like you have stepped into Elfheim, and she does a really good job of that. It is mortal girl, Fae guy, fantasy romance, and enemies to lovers, slow burn, which is personally how I like it. Cardan. Okay, like I'm gonna link my whole video where I talk about this series, and that isn't spoiler free, so if you haven't read it yet, might not want to watch that. But just Cardan is definitely a man written by a woman who understands me. She just got it. She understood the assignment, and I just gotta say, everything about this book, I cannot sing its praises enough. And Holly Black's world building and her, I think the pacing, I know some people have a little bit of issues with the pacing in the first book, but I understand how it's a little bit slower in the first book, but it didn't upset me. Personally, I still was very much pulled in right away, and I stayed in, and it does pick up more towards the end. However, it wasn't like offensively bad throughout the book with the pacing where I was super bored. I kept wanting to read it. So yeah, that's really all I can say without spoiling too much about these books. Oh, One more. How could I forget? The Fellowship of the Ring. So this is not for the unprepared. Let me put it that way. These are books to get you into fantasy. However, this one is if you just want to dive into the deep end. Tolkien is the master of world building. He is like the father of it all. He really, really goes in deep. So throughout the book, he does go into detail about the elves and the hobbits and Middle Earth and this world he's created and the One Ring and everything going on. However, the majority of the overwhelmingness, I don't think that's a word, but whatever, is in the appendixes, where he really goes in and tells you a lot more about everyone's whole future and everyone's whole life, because this man did not take a breather. It really kind of gives you an appreciation, if you didn't already have an appreciation for world building and writing it and all that, everything that comes with it, because you realize that the amount of backstories and work that goes into it is just so much. Just planning out, and you are creating a whole new world. And he very much did this because, like I said, he's like the father of it all. It really gives you a new outlook, if you don't already have it, on what goes into creating fantasy and all that. So highly recommend this, even if it's not what you start with reading Lord of the Rings eventually. I can see why people are scared of it, and I can see there's not going to be that romance and that kind of stuff that you're going to get in a book like this, but it's still fantasy wise, and it's such a cute story too, like the messaging and the moral of it all, and the found family, and just Frodo and Sam. You gotta love Frodo and Sam, especially in the book, especially with the old writing of them being like so cute, and it's like, you know? Yeah, these are my recommendations for now for fantasy books. I definitely am going to make this a type of series where it's not just like part 1, part 2, but something that I'm going to continue to do down the line, where when I think of more fantasy recommendations, I might not call it what I did for this video of books to get you into fantasy, just more fantasy recommendations. I'm sorry it wasn't scripted. Maybe I'll script the future ones if I am editing this and feel like it's all over the place and feel like I didn't really give good enough explanations. However, I didn't want to spoil anything because these are recommendations to get you into it. So, and I'm just like, I don't want to just read you the synopsis of the book, but if I go into my review of it, I'm gonna give spoilers because I just haven't quite figured out how to not do that. So I hope I did give you enough information. If you like fantasy romance is my favorite, but I obviously read a lot of just fantasy. Like and subscribe, because I will be doing more videos where even I just mention fantasy books or more fantasy book recommendations. And I know down the line I'm definitely going to do romantasy specific recommendations. And yeah, I also plan on doing some monthly like reading wrap-ups where there's going to be fantasy books and just talk more about my favorite series. I like to talk specifically, I've said this in past videos, but if you're new here, I specifically like to talk about books that I like as opposed to books that I don't like. So I do have videos where I've already done that, but in those videos I said in the future I am going to focus on books that I like. So yeah, if you like this, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Bye!